Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have been the original changemakers and stewards of Australia for over 60,000 years. Their profound wisdom, resilience, and deep connection to country have fostered countless stories of survival, adaptation, and transformation. The knowledge held by these communities is an invaluable resource for understanding how to create positive change and build a more just and sustainable world. Welcome back to Changemaker Q&A, everyone. I'm so stoked to jump into today's topic. This is probably the topic or question that I get asked about the most. And the reason I have kind of like avoided answering any questions about it so far is because it is all about my PhD research. And I didn't want to share anything because until I actually have published my research, everything I would be sharing would all kind of just be like my own opinion, and it wouldn't really be backed up by anything. And obviously in every episode we dive into a theory of change or a framework, and that's always an established theory of change or framework that's always kind of backed up by existing research and existing information. So I have kind of been skeptical to get on here and kind of put forth my research as its own theory of change until I was able to kind of back it up with some publications. And I just got back from presenting my research in Bangkok at the Future of Women conference, and I have put together the paper that is going to be published. So now that there is a publication with this framework in it, I feel happy to kind of jump on here and share the framework with you guys a bit. And today's episode is not going to be answering any of the specific questions I've gotten about my research. But what I'm going to be doing is essentially taking the presentation that I gave at this conference and presenting it to you guys in a kind of more accessible, digestible format, so that hopefully you don't need an academic background to kind of understand it. I'll be touching on a couple of academic concepts, particularly when it comes to research philosophies, but I'll try and explain them in really simple to understand terminology. Essentially, what this paper that I presented was not about my entire research as a whole, because it would be incredibly hard to summarize 3.5 years of research into a 15-minute conference presentation or a 5,000 word paper. So instead what I did was I kind of took the theoretical framework or the philosophical underpinnings of my research, and I presented that because I figured that was probably the part of my research that was most relevant to the audience, no matter where in the world they were from or no matter what kind of like issues they were working on. So I'm hoping it's the same for you guys. I'm hoping that you find a lot of value in this framework and you can kind of see how it's something that you might begin to apply in your own life or your own work. The framework that I'm going to kind of explain in this episode, I will also be running a free online training, a masterclass, workshop, whatever you want to call it, where I'll essentially be taking the framework and helping you understand what that actually looks like in your own life and kind of creating your own empowerment-centered theory of change for the work that you're doing. So if you really like this episode and you want to learn more, I encourage you to check the description below. I'll leave all of the details. If you can't attend the training live, there will be a replay for you to watch. You'll just have to make sure you subscribe or sign up, whatever you're prompted to do, depending on when you're watching this, so that you can access it. So without further ado, I want to start by giving you the kind of background of my research. So my research, for those of you who don't know, is with two universities. One is based here in Australia, the other is based in India. So for my PhD fieldwork, I was based in India, and essentially what my research is looking to do is come up with some more appropriate indicators for the fifth of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Target 5B. If you don't know what the Sustainable Development Goals or you're not really familiar with them, definitely check out our previous episode that I did on kind of the transition from the Millennium Development Goals to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. I just go into it in a little bit more detail. Always good to kind of like wrap your head around what the SDGs are, because these are kind of like the global development agenda. It's kind of what every country in the world, every development organization, whether it is at a transnational, national, or local level, this is kind of the agenda that they are all following. And in that episode, I actually critiqued one of kind of the biggest barriers that I see to the Sustainable Development Goals is that even though we've got these really wonderful kind of audacious goals, the indicators that are put forward in the framework aren't really reflective of the changes that we would need to see in order for these goals to be reached. And the example that I give is based on my own research, and that is for Sustainable Development Goal 5, which is to empower all women and girls and promote gender equality. So there are two types of targets for each SDG. There are outcome targets and there are means of implementation targets. And 5B is the second of the means of implementation targets. And this target is to use information technologies to empower women. Very reasonable goal that I think we can all agree would be a really important means of implementing different development interventions around the world. But the only indicator that they actually have for this SDG is the proportion of women to men who own a mobile phone. And the whole point of the SDG framework is that it is something that all countries agree to. And whether you're in India or Australia, whether you are in North America, Sub-Saharan Africa, Oceania, South America, whatever part of the world you're in, everybody has the same goals. And this indicator is not really I think, good indicator of whether ICTs are actually being used to empower women. So that was kind of where I started off with my research, and I set out to hopefully kind of come up with some more appropriate indicators that we could use for this SDG, particularly in the Indian context. And what I kind of found as I dived into my research a little bit more was particularly the reason that an indicator like that isn't a very good indicator is because it focuses on differences. Outcome targets, they focus on a static difference. So they focus on what we would call the changes. So it's, this particular human right was not being met and now it is. These are two differences. Or we could say that this is the situation for men and this is how it is for women. These are two differences. And outcome targets measure the changes, whether that's between two groups or between 2 points in time. And that's totally fine. But with the means of implementation targets, because means of implementation are about processes, and processes of change are not static. They're these dynamic, ongoing processes. And we can't really rely on static indicators or differences to measure a process. So that's kind of why the proportion of women to men isn't a really good indicator of empowerment. The proportion of women to men owning a mobile phone is a really important indicator of gender equality in terms of whether men and women have equal access to information technologies, but it's not really indicative of whether those information technologies are actually being used to empower women. And when we think about the kind of causal relationship between empowerment and the proportion of women to men who own a mobile phone, we can kind of see why this might be. It's completely possible for a population to meet that indicator criteria without the mobile phones necessarily empowering them. It's also completely possible for them to be empowered but not meet that criteria in terms of the proportion of men to women who own a mobile phone. And that's something that I saw in India. There were a lot of times where technologies and mobile phone technologies had actually been used to empower women, but these women didn't necessarily own their own mobile phone. They may have shared the mobile phone that their husbands own. And a lot of the time that was simply because it wasn't an affordable thing for them to both own a mobile phone, but that didn't necessarily prevent the women from being empowered by having access to this technology. And then, of course, we could have a situation where women are being empowered and an equal proportion of women to men own a mobile phone, but they don't actually have any necessarily causal connection. So the mobile phones aren't actually the thing that are empowering women. So if we want to measure how technology is being used to empower women, we need better indicators. And this research problem kind of, I guess, forced me to really kind of step back and question the nature of change itself. If we're creating indicators for a dynamic change process and not just static differences between point A and point B, then I needed to have a better understanding of change itself in order to kind of begin to think how we might set indicators for a change process. And this kind of led me to different research philosophies. Sustainable and ethical business practices are at the heart of Changemaker Co. All of our upcycled and slow fashion teas are digitally printed in Brisbane using sustainable water-based inks and shipped in recyclable or biodegradable packaging. For every online order that is placed, we will plant one tree with our climate-positive tree planting partner, Ontology. All of the remaining profits from our sales are redistributed to our impact partner, the Humanitarian Changemakers Network, providing workshops, events, solutions-focused news and resources to catalyse young Australians to become active across the social change space. And for those of you who are interested, I use a critical realist philosophy, which is a realist ontology and a relativist epistemology. And if those words don't mean anything to you, don't worry, it's not important. What is important is this framework that will kind of help illustrate it. So in the book, Hospicing Modernity, which was published in 2021 by Vanessa Mercado de Oliveira, she uses this analogy of an olive tree to kind of illustrate the metaphysics of modernity. And when we say metaphysics, we're really just talking about the philosophy that is associated with reality. So within metaphysics, and particularly in the context of research, we have this tree. And at the top of the tree, we have the leaves. And the leaves represent the methodological approaches that we take, particularly when we are looking to solve challenges or problems associated with modernity. So a methodological theory or approach tends to be prescriptive. So it's kind of focusing on ways of doing, and it's about recommending strategies for how we might actually empower people in a specific situation in the context of my research. So a methodological approach tends to assume that the system that we're operating in isn't really operating as effectively as it could be. And so it proposes these alternative ways of doing things. It looks at finding new solutions and innovative ways that we can kind of tackle these problems. So that's the leaves of our olive tree. If we move down, we have the branches of the different leaves. And one branch obviously can hold a number of different leaves, and the branches represent the epistemological approaches. So epistemological approaches are more descriptive in nature, and they focus on ways of knowing. So epistemology is the philosophy associated with knowledge. It's looking at how we know things, how we acquire things, I guess the nature of truth and what truth looks like. And epistemological approaches in the West in particular tend to really prioritize empiricism. So we kind of think that unless we can empirically observe or measure something, then we can't really know about that thing. That is a very Western perspective. In the East, they tend to have more holistic ways of looking at things. And that's also true, I think, if we look at Indigenous knowledge and the epistemology of particularly Indigenous Australian knowledge, it tends to be a lot more holistic. They don't necessarily rely on like scientific observation or empirical analysis in order to know things. Knowledge is something that you can actually find in the landscape or the environment around you. Knowledge is also something that can be passed on through story. So there are different ways of knowing, and that's what epistemological approaches are really about. So in the context of empowerment, an epistemological approach is one that it's going to focus on what empowerment actually looks like in a particular situation, what an empowerment process ought to entail, or what specific indicators we could be looking at to know if somebody is empowered in a particular context. So epistemological approaches, they kind of look at the system and they say, the system is a little bit broken. Let's see if we can use new ways of knowing to actually fix the system itself. Those are the branches. Holding up our branches and all of the leaves that stem from those branches is the tree trunk. And the trunk is kind of like the visible trunk, but it also includes the invisible roots below the surface that we can't see. And this part of our olive tree represents the ontological approaches. Now, ontological approaches tend to be more explanatory. So they are kind of a way of explaining how things are or how things could be. And ontology in philosophy is really about the nature of being or the nature of how something exists within reality. So it's really about this idea of existence and ways of being in terms of like approaches that challenge ways of being or propose new ways of being or simply explore ways of being are those that kind of look at the system. And unlike our methodological approaches, which say, you know what, the system's not operating as best it could, let's try and change things and do things more efficiently, or our epistemological approaches, which say, the system is a little bit broken, let's try and actually fix and change the system. The ontological approaches are actually saying, you know what, is this system really the best system we could be operating in? What would happen if we just completely got rid of the system and replaced it? And it kind of is coming from this assumption that in the context of modernity, ways of knowing and ways of doing that are shaped by modernity are never going to be enough to actually overcome those challenges of modernity. And so it's kind of about proposing new ways of being by exploring those really kind of fundamental aspects of reality: space, time, change. You can probably see where I'm going with this. So this was where my research kind of sat. It sat at this ontological layer. And what it really aimed to do was uncover the kind of true causal mechanisms of why something is empowering. And my aim was to hopefully uncover those kind of causal mechanisms that are kind of at the core of empowerment as an ontological thing. So looking at empowerment as something that exists ontologically and seeing if I could kind of uncover those causal mechanisms that would apply in different contexts. So that was kind of where my research sits. And I believe I was pretty successful in developing a more ontological model of empowerment. And to kind of summarize what I would kind of define empowerment as, based on my research, because we probably all have different ideas of empowerment. We have all experienced empowerment, so we know what it feels like. We know that it kind of exists in some way. But if every single person listening to me right now was to think of an experience that empowered them, and, you know, we all shared what our experience was, chances are we would probably have really different experiences of empowerment. And that's because it's not actually that event or that experience that empowered you. This is the reason it empowered you. So empowerment is not necessarily an event or a change, but it's the result of a change process in which an agent, or what I call a subject, experiences a qualitative or quantitative change in their transformative power. So I'll just unpack that a little bit. Apologies for the beeping. I have my lunch in the air fryer, so that's what that was. We know that empowerment is not an event or a static change. It's something that it actually emerges from a change process. And it's not just any change process. The change process needs to have an agent, so like the person, the subject that we're interested in assessing, experiencing either a qualitative or a quantitative change in their transformative power. So a quantitative change in their transformative power would mean they have an increase. So the power that they have has increased. If it was a qualitative change in their transformative power, it would mean that the transformative power that they have has actually kind of changed a little bit and transformed into something new. Either way, it's about having this increase in transformative power. Now, power at its most kind of like fundamental level is simply the potential for something to cause an effect. So power is essentially the potential of some entity, something, to cause an effect. Now, that potential doesn't actually need to be realized. It doesn't actually need to be activated. It doesn't need to happen. It's just there, okay? It exists as potential. And if that is something that you're not quite able to like wrap your head around, the previous episode that we did was looking at manifestation in social change and really breaking manifestation down into the way in which we bring something forth that doesn't exist into reality. And we look at the intransitive and the transitive dimensions of reality. So to use that kind of language, what we would say is power is something, it's potential for change that exists intransitively. And then once we can kind of realize that power and activate it, that's when it becomes more transitive. So the way we typically understand power, particularly when we're talking about social change related issues, is as a kind of relative form of power that is expressed from an object to a subject. And it typically is power, what we would call power over. Power over is power of control or force. And that is what I refer to as negative power. I'm not going to go too much into the differences in power in this episode because I could do a whole nother episode on it. And if that's something you would like, definitely let me know. But essentially, the way I define negative power is if we think of it as this causal relationship, it's something that we're looking at a change process, right? So we're not just looking at the power of one entity, whether that's a person or an institution or whatever it might be, a group, compared to another entity, person, group, institution. We're looking at how the power changes or shifts after some kind of change process, because empowerment is about a change process. So negative power is essentially when a change process results in the object of power, which is the thing expressing power, when it essentially takes power away from the subject. So it's a negative causal relationship. An increase in variable A leads to a decrease in variable B and vice versa. So it's a change in one variable results in change in the opposite direction, to use systems thinking terms. That is a negative power relationship. And that is the type of change process that could be disempowering. Then if we had a change process where the object is expressing its power and this subject is involved in the change process somehow, but it doesn't actually affect their transformative power, that is what I would consider an unempowering change. It doesn't mean this person wasn't affected by the change. It just means that their transformative power, their potential to cause an effect in the context of this change process, hasn't actually gone up or down. It's not been affected by the object expressing its power. So that is what I would call an unempowering change. And I would kind of consider this form of power to be power through. So unlike a disempowering change, which is power over, which is like control or force, an unempowering change is where power is expressed through something. So it's there, but it's not really having an effect. A positive power relationship is the one that we're most concerned about. And this is where the object of power is expressing power somehow throughout a change process. And the subject is getting a gain in power. So they're increasing power as well, whether that is a quantitative or qualitative increase. The object expresses power, the subject also gains power. So that's a positive causal relationship where an increase in variable A leads to an increase in variable B, change in the same direction. That's a positive causal relationship. So that type of power is transformative power. And transformative power is essentially power for an agent to transform, so to change their social conditions. So anything to do with their cultural, structural, agental dimensions of their society. That is change that can be empowering. Emphasis on the can be. What we're talking about here are general tendencies. So these are the way things tend to causally affect one another. But the social world is an open system. It is complex. We can never really know for sure if something is going to affect something else, but it has a general tendency to do so. Something that I follow in my research, being a critical realist researcher, is this idea that there are no universal laws in the social world that govern the social world. There are kind of norms or tendencies, but you can never really be sure. So that's just a little side note for anyone who's interested. So essentially, this is what empowerment looks like in a change process. It's when an agent experiences a qualitative or quantitative increase in their transformative power, their potential to transform their social conditions. They don't have to transform their social conditions. They just need to get the power that enables them to do so, the capacity for them to actually act on it at some point in time. It's no surprise that I'm a huge advocate of place-based learning, which is why I love booking travel experiences with Get Your Guide. While I was doing my PhD fieldwork in India, I booked a number of tours through Get Your Guide so that I could get out and experience as much of India's culture as possible. Whether you're on holiday, working away, or looking for new experiences in your hometown, Get Your Guide helps travelers discover the best things to do with niche offerings you won't find anywhere else. To book your next experience, head to the link in the episode description. If we think back to our olive tree and we're thinking about our ontology of modernity, we can actually go a little bit deeper on our tree trunk, and we can kind of apply this framework in the context of the ontology of a person. So ontology of people is literally just the philosophical way of saying, how do people exist in reality? And I kind of, through the critical realist philosophy, believe that there are 4 kind of like planes or domains of reality that we exist on as humans. So we are like one, like you're one person, but the way you exist in reality kind of happens on 4 different planes. So the first plane is the plane of material transactions, or what we would just call like the physical world. So I am physically here sitting on my chair, talking into a microphone. There is a physical phone in front of me. That's the material plane. It's the way you kind of relate to your environment or your surroundings in the physical world. You also exist as what we would call like a stratified personality. So this is all your psychosocial dimensions and the things that kind of make up your personality, your likes, your dislikes, your values, your beliefs, all of these things that kind of give you a personality. Now, by nature, a personality is never finished. It is always like, it's an ongoing, constantly changing thing, but you also exist as a personality. You also exist in terms of social structures. So social structures being the ways that you kind of relate to through institutions, and the way that these institutions can kind of perpetuate social ills or norms or different power dynamics. And social structures and the kind of ontological domain of social structures is very much about a geohistory, and it's very contextual. So, for example, I exist within my community, through existing institutions and power structures that make my experience as a citizen or as a consumer very different to somebody who might be a person of color or somebody who might be disabled. So we exist through these social structures. And then we also exist in this kind of fourth plane through personal relationships or the way we interact with people. So whenever we meet a person, we also exist like through the lens of whatever they see about us. So that's another way that we exist, through our interactions with people. So based on these kind of different ways that we all kind of exist within the social realm, the way that our transformative power is kind of experienced or expressed in these domains is slightly different. So in the material plane of our being, transformative power, it kind of manifests as power 4. And power 4 is really the power of possibilities. It's the power for you to make something that doesn't currently exist in your reality actually materialize. In the domain of your embodied, stratified personality, transformative power will be experienced as power within. So this is about your kind of autonomy and, your ability to make decisions and choose based on your values and your experiences. Transformative power on the domain of social structures is what we would call power 2. Power 2 is essentially the power or the freedom for you to do things, for you to take action, and for you to be, for you to exist as you are. And that one is very closely tied to safety as well. Finally, we have the domain of personal relationships. And if we get transformative power and we're kind of expressing it or experiencing it in that domain, it will be experienced as power with. Power with is kind of the cumulative power when you can come together with another person or another group of people and combine knowledge, combine resources, combine whatever it might be, in order for you to kind of amplify change in your own life and kind of continue to push it forward. So that is the different types of transformative power. So essentially, empowerment is what we get when we are continuing to build our transformative power in each of these 4 domains. And just a note, for anybody who might be a social worker or a development practitioner or even somebody working in government or policy, when we kind of have this understanding of empowerment as something that emerges from this process of building transformative power, we can kind of reframe the goal of a lot of our interventions from, we want to empower women, to just focusing on building their transformative power. Because the only person who's ever going to know if that's actually going to empower them is the person themselves, the agent themselves. You can't impose empowerment on someone else. It has to be something that they actually take. They get this transformative power and they actually say, okay, cool, I'm actually going to use this new potential that I have to create change, and I'm actually going to go forward. So the most you can ever do is build the transformative power of people. It's up to them and also, their different social conditions, because the social world is an open system, as to whether or not that power can actually be activated in order for them to be empowered. But that's essentially what the process of empowerment looks like. So it's when we have this change process and we're building the transformative power of women. And the great thing about this is, first of all, this isn't just some idea or way of looking at empowerment that kind of fits into the lens that we would say is an appropriate development lens within the context of modernity. It's actually drilling down to the ontological core and saying, what must the world be like, or what must some change process be like for a woman to experience empowerment at its fundamental ontological core? And that is what empowerment is. So if you think back to an experience of something that empowered you in your life, it wasn't actually that specific event or that experience that made it empowering. It was the fact that that event or that experience was actually able to activate your transformative power, build your transformative power, whether that was your power for, power within, power to, or power with. That's what made it empowering. And when we have this process of empowerment and we understand that this is not a change process that needs to be put into motion by any like development organization, any government, any group, whatever it might be. This is how transformative change actually happens. So this process of empowerment is actually what causes transformative change. So with this understanding of empowerment, we can actually not just have empowerment as this nice to have little add-on in our development interventions, or, you know, we've got all of these outcome goals that we want to focus on and, you know, we want to try to empower women. It's like, you know, the sprinkle on top of the cake. No. Empowerment is the process of actually baking the cake. Empowerment is the cause, it's the driver, it's the mechanism of transformative change. So this is a very fundamental ontological kind of framework, explanatory framework that explains how empowerment actually exists. So if we think back to our analogy of the olive tree, with this ontological framework for empowerment, it's up to everybody else listening to this, anybody who reads the research paper, anybody who kind of takes this on, to actually add your own epistemological branches and your own methodological leaves to this. This is like a kind of core framework that can then be used to kind of be like the solid trunk of our tree for everything else to grow out of. So I encourage you to kind of think about if you are somebody who kind of works in that space of epistemology, you're looking at different ways of knowing. So you could begin to kind of ask, questions like, depending on the context you're working in what ways do things like patriarchy or caste or capitalism combine to create systems of oppression that disempower women in the specific context that you're working in? So we have the tree trunk, we have our kind of fundamental framework for empowerment as like the necessary cause of transformative change. So if you're taking an epistemological approach, you would say, well, okay, what things are currently disempowering women that are not allowing us to actually kind of harness and utilize this natural process of transformative change for them to change their own lives? If you're somebody who's working at that kind of the level of the leaves, the methodological approaches, you would be asking questions like, with what we know about this specific context that we're working in, how can we work best to actually work with the women that we're working with or the people that we're working with to build their transformative power in a particular situation, whether that's economically, financially, politically, in the context of their family, the workplace, whatever it might be. So I hope that was simple enough to understand. I encourage you to check out the article that goes along with this episode, because all of the slides from my presentation that I gave are on there. So you'll actually be able to kind of see this model of empowerment, what it actually looks like, and visualize it. And it's kind of just like a good summary to kind of help you wrap your head around what the difference is between ontology, epistemology, and methodology in our research or our theories of change, as well as the actual explanatory framework for empowerment that I developed through my research. If you are keen to read the research paper when it is published, that will kind of use my framework. It'll explain the framework, but it will use the framework then as a basis, and it'll actually give you some examples from my fieldwork in Bihar in the north of India, working with women agricultural labourers, and women in Tamil Nadu in the south of India, women who work in garment factories and textile mills. It'll actually kind of show you how I used that explanatory framework for empowerment, looked at it epistemologically through different lenses. So for the women in Tamil Nadu, one group of them were Dalit women. So we were really focusing on how caste is kind of something that disempowers women in this particular context. And then it also shows the specific examples from all of my focus group discussions about the kind of main areas or main things that would empower women in each of these kind of 4 planes of their existence or their being, their social reality. So if you have any more questions, definitely you can ask questions directly through Spotify or as a comment on YouTube. You can always head to humanitarianchangemakers.net/podcast and leave any questions on the form there. If you would like to take this framework that I have taught you and actually look at how you would apply it to your own life, then I really encourage you to check out the details for our workshop. It's called Supercharge Your Social Impact, and it's essentially looking at how you can use this transformative change or framework or theory of change. If you would like to see how to actually apply the framework to your own life, your own work, definitely join the workshop. So essentially the framework is something that you can use in your own personal life, in your own work across the social change space, whether you're kind of just beginning your journey or particularly whether you're somebody who's kind of been in it for a while. It really helps you to understand how you can actually take a lot of the problems and challenges that you're facing or things that might be disempowering you and actually kind of turning those into leverage points or opportunities to actually create change. If you work with other people, whether you're a teacher or a social worker or a development practitioner, somebody whose work is really focused on actually empowering others, then the framework is also great because you can use this as a way to kind of better create a theory of change for how you're going to empower the people that you're working with. In the same way that I used this framework to kind of come up with a theory of change for how the development organization that I was working with could empower the women in Bihar and Tamil Nadu, you can use the framework to actually look at how you can empower the people that you are working with in your own work. So I encourage you to come along to the workshop. It's going to be fun. The first half an hour is going to kind of be like a core lesson. The second half of the hour is actually going to be an exercise or a self-assessment exercise where you can kind of start to create your own theory of change based on the empowerment framework. And the final half an hour is totally optional, but I will stick around to answer any questions anybody has about the framework. So definitely check that one out. Okay. You want to say goodbye?